This is the story of that war, told not as a list of dates, but as a living, breathing epic. A story of nations and leaders, soldiers and civilians, triumph and tragedy. A story of how the world broke and how it was rebuilt. Chapter 1. A Broken Peace, 1918 to 1939. The Second World War did not begin with the sound of artillery or the movement of armies. It began in conference rooms, shattered economies, wounded pride, and political failures that accumulated over 2 decades. When the First World War ended in November 1918, the world emerged exhausted, traumatized, and deeply unstable. The conflict had killed more than 16 million people and wounded millions more. Entire regions of Europe were devastated, and the psychological damage extended far beyond the battlefield. The war had destroyed the illusion that modern civilization naturally progressed toward peace and reason. Instead, it revealed how industrial power, nationalism, and mass mobilization could be fused into mechanisms of destruction on an unprecedented scale. Yet the peace that followed failed to address the forces that had caused the catastrophe. Rather than healing divisions, it deepened them. The collapse of the Old World Order. The end of World War I marked the collapse of 4 major empires. The German Empire fell and was replaced by a fragile republic. Austria-Hungary disintegrated into a collection of new states burdened by ethnic tension and economic weakness. The Ottoman Empire vanished, leaving behind unstable territories shaped by foreign interests rather than local realities. Imperial Russia collapsed into revolution and civil war, ultimately giving rise to the Soviet Union. The disappearance of these empires created a vacuum. New nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others were formed, but their borders often ignored ethnic, linguistic, and religious realities. Minority populations found themselves trapped in hostile states, breeding resentment and instability. Instead of a stable balance of power, Europe inherited a fragmented and volatile political landscape. The Treaty of Versailles. The central pillar of the post-war settlement was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. Its stated purpose was to prevent Germany from ever again threatening European peace. Its actual effect was to humiliate and destabilize a defeated nation. Germany lost significant territory, including Alsace-Lorraine and parts of Prussia. Its overseas colonies were seized. The German military was reduced to 100,000 men, forbidden tanks, aircraft, and submarines. Perhaps most damaging were the reparations imposed on Germany, forcing it to accept full responsibility for the war and to pay enormous sums to the victors. For the Allied powers, these terms were justified by the scale of destruction Germany had caused. For Germans, they were experienced as collective punishment. The German army had not been decisively destroyed on German soil. Many citizens believed defeat had been engineered by politicians rather than suffered militarily. This belief hardened into the stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies, particularly socialists, liberals, and Jews. This myth would become a cornerstone of extremist propaganda. The fragility of the Weimar Republic. Germany's new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was born into crisis. It faced opposition from both the far left and far right, economic devastation, and public distrust. Democracy itself was associated with defeat, humiliation, and instability. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s wiped out savings and destroyed the middle class. Currency became worthless. Workers were paid multiple times per day so wages could be spent before prices rose again. Trust in institutions evaporated. Though temporary stabilization occurred later in the decade, the system remained fragile and dependent on foreign loans. The underlying problems were unresolved. Global economic collapse. In 1929, the global economy collapsed. The Great Depression spread rapidly, devastating industrial economies and agricultural regions alike. International trade collapsed, banks failed, unemployment soared into the tens of millions. Governments appeared powerless, parliamentary debate seemed inadequate in the face of mass suffering. Desperation radicalized populations across continents. Extremist movements thrived by offering certainty, identity, and blame. Fascism and the appeal of authoritarianism. Italy provided the first example. Despite being on the winning side of World War I, Italy felt cheated by the peace settlement. Political paralysis and economic instability paved the way for radical solutions. In 1922, Benito Mussolini seized power. Fascism rejected democracy, glorified violence, and demanded absolute loyalty to the state. It promised order, national rebirth, and imperial expansion. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League of Nations condemned the invasion but failed to stop it. Sanctions were weak and ineffective. Aggression succeeded. The lesson was unmistakable. Hitler and the Nazi state. Germany followed with catastrophic consequences. Adolf Hitler rose by exploiting resentment, fear, and racial hatred. His ideology fused extreme nationalism with pseudo-scientific racism and conspiracy theories. Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat, economic hardship, and cultural decline. Communism was portrayed as an existential threat. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. Within months, democracy was dismantled. Opposition parties were banned. Independent media vanished. Germany became a totalitarian state. Rearmament began immediately. International treaties were ignored. The Rhineland was remilitarized. Austria was annexed. Czechoslovakia was dismantled through diplomatic coercion and military threat. Western powers responded with appeasement, believing concessions would preserve peace. They underestimated Hitler's ambitions and overestimated their ability to contain him. Asia before Europe. While Europe drifted toward war, Asia was already engulfed in it. Japan, driven by militarism and resource scarcity, expanded aggressively. In 1931, it seized Manchuria. In 1937, it launched full-scale war against China. Japanese forces committed widespread atrocities. Cities were destroyed. Civilians massacred. Millions died years before Europe entered the conflict. International response was again ineffective. The collapse of peace. By 1939, the international system had failed completely. The League of Nations was powerless. Treaties were meaningless. Military force determined outcomes. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, secretly dividing Eastern Europe between them. With its eastern flank secured, Germany prepared for war. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. The fragile peace of the post-World War I era collapsed, and the world entered a conflict that would reshape history. Chapter 2. The war begins. Blitzkrieg and collapse, 1939 to 1941. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, marked the violent opening of the Second World War, but it also revealed something entirely new about how wars would be fought. German forces did not advance cautiously or methodically. Instead, they struck with speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Tanks, aircraft, infantry, and artillery moved as a single organism. The strategy was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it shattered every assumption inherited from the First World War. Poland was attacked from the west by Germany, and 2 weeks later from the east by the Soviet Union under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Polish army fought with determination, but it was outmatched technologically and strategically. German aircraft destroyed communication lines and transportation hubs. Armored units bypassed strongpoints, encircled defenders, and advanced deep into the rear. Within weeks, organized resistance collapsed. The fall of Poland demonstrated that speed and coordination could break even determined defenses. It also exposed the weakness of Europe's political guarantees. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but they were unprepared to act decisively. The conflict entered a strange phase known as the Phony War, in which armies mobilized but rarely fought. The Axis expands. While Western Europe waited, Germany consolidated its gains and prepared for expansion. In April 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered within hours. Norway resisted longer, but German airborne troops and naval forces secured key ports and airfields. Control of Norway gave Germany access to Atlantic routes and iron ore shipments vital to its war economy. The campaign revealed both German innovation and Allied disorganization. Once again, speed and surprise proved decisive. In May 1940, the main blow fell in the West. The fall of France. France had built the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications designed to prevent another German invasion. But German planners bypassed it entirely. Armored divisions pushed through the Ardennes forest, terrain considered impassable for tanks, crossed the Meuse River, and raced toward the English Channel. The maneuver trapped Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. As German units closed in, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were driven toward the coast. At Dunkirk, a desperate evacuation began. Civilian boats joined naval vessels to rescue trapped troops. Over 330,000 soldiers were saved, but nearly all heavy equipment was abandoned. France collapsed shortly afterward. Paris fell without resistance. In June 1940, France surrendered. The country was divided between German occupation and a collaborationist regime based in Vichy. The fall of France stunned the world. A nation considered militarily dominant had been defeated in 6 weeks. Britain alone. With France defeated, Britain stood alone against Germany. Adolf Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. Instead, the British government, led by Winston Churchill, refused. Germany prepared to invade, but first it needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain became the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. German bombers targeted airfields, radar stations, and factories. British pilots, vastly outnumbered, relied on early warning radar and ground control to intercept attacks. When Germany shifted bombing to civilian cities, British morale hardened rather than collapsed. London endured sustained bombardment during the Blitz. Civilians slept in shelters and subway stations. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Germany failed to gain air superiority. The invasion was postponed indefinitely. It was the first major defeat of Nazi Germany. The Mediterranean and North Africa. As Britain resisted in the air, the war spread south. Italy, under Mussolini, entered the conflict seeking territorial gains. Italian forces attacked British positions in North Africa but suffered early defeats. Germany intervened, sending General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps. Desert warfare became a test of logistics and endurance. Battles surged back and forth across the sands of Libya and Egypt. Control of supply lines mattered more than tactical brilliance. The Mediterranean became a critical theater, tying down forces and shaping global strategy. The Axis at its peak. By 1941, the Axis powers dominated much of Europe. Germany controlled territory from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. Italy held parts of the Mediterranean. Japan continued its expansion in Asia. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Germany had failed to defeat Britain. Its economy was not fully mobilized for total war. Its leadership increasingly ignored logistical realities. Strategic decisions were shaped by ideology rather than necessity. Adolf Hitler now turned east. Operation Barbarossa begins. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. Millions of soldiers crossed the border, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. He underestimated Soviet manpower, industrial capacity, and willingness to endure staggering losses. The invasion marked a decisive escalation. The war was no longer about territory alone. It became a war of annihilation. By the end of 1941, Germany was fighting a global conflict against enemies with greater industrial potential. The lightning victories of the early war had created an illusion of invincibility. That illusion was about to be shattered. Chapter 3. A World at War, 1941 to 1943. By the end of 1941, the Second World War had transformed from a European conflict into a truly global struggle. What had begun with regional invasions and limited objectives now consumed continents, oceans, and entire populations. Decisions made by leaders in Berlin, Tokyo, Washington, and Moscow expanded the war beyond any possibility of containment. The year 1941 marked the point of no return. Operation Barbarossa and the War of Annihilation. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military assault in human history. Over 3 million Axis soldiers crossed a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Thousands of tanks and aircraft supported the advance. Entire Soviet border armies were overwhelmed in the opening weeks. German strategy relied on speed and encirclement. Soviet units were trapped, cut off, and destroyed in massive pockets. Millions of Red Army soldiers were captured. Cities fell. Vast territories were seized. But Barbarossa was never a conventional military campaign. From its conception, it was a war of ideology and extermination. German orders authorized mass executions of political commissars, Jews, and civilians suspected of resistance. Mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed the advancing armies, murdering entire communities. The Soviet Union suffered staggering losses, yet it did not collapse. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Equipment wore down. Fuel and ammunition ran short. The vast distances of the Soviet Union absorbed the initial shock of invasion. Civilians played a critical role in resistance. Factories were dismantled and relocated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Workers labored under brutal conditions to restart production. Entire populations were mobilized for survival. When winter arrived, German troops were unprepared. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Vehicles failed. Soldiers suffered frostbite and starvation. Soviet counterattacks halted the advance outside Moscow. The war in the East had become a struggle of endurance. Japan strikes the United States. While Germany fought in the Soviet Union, events in the Pacific reshaped the war entirely. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over 2,000 Americans were killed. The attack was intended to cripple American power long enough for Japan to secure its empire across Southeast Asia. Instead, it unified the United States and brought its immense industrial capacity fully into the war. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The conflict was now global in every sense. Axis expansion in Asia and the Pacific. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces advanced with remarkable speed. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, once considered impregnable, collapsed. The Philippines were overrun. European colonial empires in Asia crumbled almost overnight. Japan seized oil fields, rubber plantations, and strategic ports. For a brief moment, it appeared dominant. But Japan's success masked critical weaknesses. Its industrial base was limited. Its navy, though powerful, could not replace losses quickly. Its leaders underestimated American production and resolve. The Pacific War became a battle of distance, logistics, and attrition. The battle for the seas. Across the Atlantic, the war at sea intensified. German U-boats targeted Allied shipping in an effort to starve Britain into submission. Merchant vessels were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Victory depended on technology and coordination. Radar, sonar, convoy systems, and intelligence gradually turned the tide. The ability to produce ships faster than they could be destroyed became decisive. Control of the seas allowed the Allies to move men, equipment, and supplies across vast distances. Without it, victory would have been impossible. North Africa and the Mediterranean. In North Africa, British and Axis forces fought for control of strategic routes and oil supplies. Desert warfare demanded mobility, discipline, and logistics. Battles surged back and forth across Libya and Egypt. German commander Erwin Rommel achieved early successes, but supply shortages limited his effectiveness. Allied forces, supported by growing American involvement, gradually gained the upper hand. The Mediterranean campaign tied down Axis resources and opened pathways for future Allied offensives. Civilians in a global war. As the war expanded, civilians everywhere became targets. Cities were bombed, food was rationed, families were separated, entire societies were reorganized around war production. In occupied Europe, populations lived under constant surveillance and terror. Forced labor, deportations, and executions became routine. Resistance movements emerged, sabotaging infrastructure and gathering intelligence at enormous personal risk. In Asia, civilians suffered under brutal occupation regimes. Forced labor, starvation, and mass violence were widespread. The war spared no one. Turning points. By 1942 and 1943, the momentum began to shift. In the Soviet Union, German forces were halted and then encircled at Stalingrad. The battle became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. Entire armies were destroyed. The psychological impact was immense. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway crippled Japan's carrier fleet. The loss was irreplaceable. American forces began advancing through island chains, cutting supply lines and isolating Japanese garrisons. The Axis powers had reached their limits. The war was far from over, but its direction had changed. The world was now locked in a struggle that would end only with total victory or total destruction. Chapter 4. Total War and Genocide, 1942 to 1944. By 1942, the Second World War had entered a stage unlike any previous conflict in human history. It was a war without limits, stretching across continents, oceans, and societies. The concept of total war, where entire nations, economies, and populations were mobilized, was no longer theoretical. Factories became weapons factories, streets became front lines, and civilians were conscripted into both production and survival. Industrialized warfare. Every major power converted its economy to sustain the war effort. In the United States, entire cities were reshaped around industrial production. Automobile plants became tank and aircraft factories. Women, previously excluded from heavy industry, flooded the workforce. The iconic image of Rosie, the riveter, symbolized the enormous human effort required to sustain the war. In the Soviet Union, factories were dismantled and transported eastward, beyond the reach of advancing German troops. Workers toiled under harsh conditions, often sleeping in the factories themselves. Production levels increased despite constant threats of bombing and sabotage. Every ounce of effort contributed directly to the survival of nations and the defeat of the Axis. In Germany and occupied Europe, industry served both the war and the ideological goals of the Nazi regime. Factories produced weapons, vehicles, and equipment, but they also relied heavily on forced labor from occupied populations. Millions of civilians were deported to work under brutal conditions, often for survival alone. Strategic bombing and civilian targets. Total war meant that civilian populations were no longer peripheral. They became targets for strategic bombing campaigns designed to destroy morale, infrastructure, and industrial capacity. In Germany, British and American bombers leveled entire cities. Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were reduced to rubble. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Smoke and fire obscured city skylines, and survivors faced homelessness, hunger, and trauma. In Japan, American air campaigns followed similar patterns. Firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 destroyed more than 16 square miles of the city, killing over 100,000 people in a single night. Civilians were trapped, with no ability to defend themselves, caught in the machinery of modern warfare. The war now encompassed every aspect of life, transforming entire societies into instruments of destruction. The Holocaust. Among the darkest chapters of this period was the Holocaust, the systematic, state-organized genocide carried out by Nazi Germany. Millions of Jews, Romani people, political prisoners, disabled individuals, and other targeted groups were murdered in extermination camps, ghettos, and mass shootings. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were industrialized sites of death. Victims were transported in trains, often under inhumane conditions, and murdered upon arrival. The Nazi bureaucracy treated murder as a logistical operation, calculating transportation, gas usage, and personnel in chilling detail. Holocaust survivors described the unimaginable terror of living under constant threat of annihilation. Entire communities were erased. Families were destroyed. The scale of the atrocity dwarfed prior historical genocides in both method and efficiency. Occupation, resistance, and reprisals. Across Europe, resistance movements sprang up in occupied territories. In France, Poland, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere, civilians risked everything to sabotage German operations, gather intelligence, and protect the persecuted. These efforts were critical to the broader Allied war strategy. However, reprisals were brutal. Entire villages were massacred, hostages executed, and communities destroyed in response to even minor acts of resistance. Civilians bore a double burden: survival and defiance. In Asia, similar patterns emerged. Japanese occupation forces committed atrocities in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The Nanjing Massacre in 1937 had already foreshadowed the cruelty, but throughout the war, forced labor, starvation, and mass killings were routine. The human cost. By 1943, the toll of total war was staggering. Millions of soldiers had died on battlefields across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Civilians, now intentionally targeted, suffered as never before. Entire cities lay in ruins. Economies were disrupted. Social structures were dislocated. Human suffering extended far beyond the armies themselves. Yet even amid destruction, innovation and resilience emerged. Nations adapted, technologies evolved, and populations endured. Civilian mobilization, espionage, resistance movements, and industrial ingenuity all contributed to sustaining the fight against Axis powers. Turning the tide. Despite the vast expansion of Axis control in 1942, cracks in their dominance became evident. In North Africa, Allied counteroffensives began to reclaim territory. In the Soviet Union, the winter of 1940–1943 set the stage for decisive battles such as Stalingrad. In the Pacific, American naval victories at Midway and Guadalcanal began to halt Japanese expansion. The totalization of the war did not guarantee Axis success. Instead, it heightened stakes, intensified suffering, and set the stage for strategic reversals. Humanity had entered a phase of warfare that blurred the line between combatants and civilians, between survival and resistance, and between political objectives and moral catastrophe. Chapter 5. The Long Road to Victory, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, the Second World War had reached a pivotal phase. The Axis powers, though still formidable, were beginning to face irreversible strategic pressure on multiple fronts. The Allies had achieved a fragile equilibrium of strength, and the coming year would decide the fate of nations. The war that had consumed the globe for half a decade was entering its final, decisive chapters, yet the human cost continued to mount at an astonishing rate. The Western Front opens. The long-awaited Allied invasion of Western Europe finally arrived on June 6, 1944, known to history as D-Day. Operation Overlord involved meticulous planning and the coordination of thousands of ships, aircraft, and personnel. The beaches of Normandy, chosen for their strategic location and relative vulnerability, became the site of one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches under heavy fire. German defenses were formidable: fortified bunkers, machine guns, minefields, and artillery. Soldiers advanced through chaos, mud, and blood. Despite horrific casualties, the Allies secured footholds on the beaches and began pushing inland. The liberation of France had begun, signaling the start of Germany's long retreat in the west. The success of D-Day required not only military might but extensive deception campaigns. The Allies employed fake equipment, misleading radio messages, and false troop movements to convince the Germans that the invasion would occur elsewhere. These efforts demonstrated that warfare now relied as heavily on strategy, intelligence, and planning as on brute force. The Eastern Front pushes west. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union continued to press its advantage on the Eastern Front. Following the victory at Stalingrad in 1943, the Red Army embarked on a relentless series of offensives that reclaimed occupied territory and inflicted enormous losses on the German army. Cities such as Kiev, Kharkov, and Smolensk were liberated amid brutal urban combat. The Soviet advance was characterized by staggering human sacrifice. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed, often with little concern for survival. Civilians were caught between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets, and widespread displacement and suffering accompanied every kilometer of territorial gain. Yet the momentum was unstoppable. The Wehrmacht could no longer maintain its positions against the combined pressures of the East and the West. Italy and the Mediterranean Campaign. In southern Europe, the Allied campaign in Italy continued to drain German resources. After the successful landings at Sicily in 1943, Allied forces moved onto the Italian mainland. The rugged terrain, fortified positions, and tenacious German defense slowed progress, turning Italy into a protracted battlefield. Despite the difficulties, Italy's campaign forced Germany to divert troops and supplies that might otherwise have reinforced the Western and Eastern fronts. The fall of Rome in June 1944 provided both a strategic and symbolic victory for the Allies, demonstrating that the Axis grip on Europe was weakening. Air power and strategic bombing. By 1944, air power had become a decisive factor in determining the war's outcome. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities, industrial centers, and transportation networks. Factories were destroyed, rail lines obliterated, and entire communities displaced. German civilians endured constant air raids, yet the war effort persisted under duress. In the Pacific, the United States employed a strategy of island hopping, gradually moving closer to the Japanese mainland. Each island seized provided airfields and naval bases, allowing the U.S. to project power and isolate Japanese garrisons. Battles at Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines exacted staggering losses on both sides, demonstrating the intensity and determination required to achieve victory in the Pacific. The collapse of German resistance. By late 1944, the pressure on Germany was immense. The Western Allies had crossed into the heart of Europe, while the Soviets were advancing from the east. Germany's industrial base was heavily bombed, its transportation network disrupted, and its civilian population demoralized. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final offensive in the West, was launched in December 1944. Initially, it achieved tactical surprise and created panic among Allied forces. Yet logistical shortcomings, overstretched troops, and the rapid Allied response turned the offensive into a catastrophic failure. Germany's capacity to wage war effectively had been exhausted. The Pacific War approaches Japan. While Europe edged toward liberation, Japan faced mounting defeats in the Pacific. The loss of carrier strength at battles such as Leyte Gulf and the protracted struggle over the Philippines had severely limited Japanese naval capabilities. Island fortifications were bypassed or isolated, and supply lines were systematically destroyed. By 1945, American forces were within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. The stage was set for the final, devastating battles that would end the Pacific conflict. Civilian strain and suffering. Throughout 1944–1945, civilians on all fronts endured profound hardships. Cities were destroyed, food was scarce, and families were uprooted. In Germany, air raids and advancing armies left millions homeless. In France and Belgium, towns were caught in the crossfire of liberation and retreating German forces. In Asia, populations faced famine, disease, and the unrelenting brutality of occupation. Despite the suffering, civilian resilience proved critical to sustaining the war effort. Factories continued to produce arms and supplies. Underground resistance movements sabotaged enemy operations. Morale, while severely tested, remained a crucial component of national endurance. The path to victory. By early 1945, Germany was surrounded and collapsing. The Western Allies advanced into Germany from France, the Soviets pressed from the east, and German forces were in disarray. Hitler's leadership had become increasingly erratic, resulting in poor military decisions and internal purges that weakened command structures. In the Pacific, the capture of Okinawa and Iwo Jima brought American forces within striking distance of Japan. Casualties were staggering, yet each victory paved the way for the final conclusion of the global conflict. The long road to victory had been paved with unimaginable human cost, strategic innovation, and a relentless commitment to defeating a seemingly unstoppable foe. As the war entered its final months, the world stood on the threshold of both liberation and destruction. Chapter 6. The Eastern Front. The Eastern Front of World War II was the theater of unprecedented scale, ferocity, and human suffering. Stretching thousands of kilometers from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, it was the site of some of the largest battles in history, the most devastating sieges, and atrocities on a scale that defies comprehension. Unlike the Western Front, where strategy often dictated movement, the Eastern Front was dominated by ideology, total war, and the collision of two massive states, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa Revisited. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was the opening salvo in what Hitler envisioned as a swift conquest of Eastern Europe. Millions of German soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, crossed the Soviet frontier in a blitzkrieg designed to shatter the Red Army before it could organize resistance. The initial success was staggering. Cities fell, armies were encircled, and millions of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. Yet the Soviet Union proved more resilient than Germany anticipated. Vast distances, brutal winters, and logistical challenges slowed the advance. Entire industrial regions had been moved east of the Ural Mountains, allowing production to continue despite territorial losses. Civilians, political commissars, and partisan fighters contributed to a defense that combined military resistance with societal endurance. Siege warfare, Leningrad and Stalingrad. Two of the most infamous episodes of the Eastern Front exemplify the brutality of total war: the sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad. Leningrad. From September 1941 to January 1944, the city endured a blockade that cut it off from supplies. Over 1 million civilians died from starvation, bombardment, and disease. Despite unimaginable suffering, the population maintained civil order, rationed food, and supported the Soviet military efforts, holding the city as a symbol of defiance. Stalingrad. The Battle for Stalingrad, August 1942, February 1943, became the turning point of the Eastern Front. Urban warfare, street by street, building by building, transformed the city into a killing ground. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army and its eventual surrender marked the first major, irreversible defeat for the Wehrmacht and shifted the strategic momentum to the Soviets. Partisan warfare and resistance. Behind the front lines, Soviet partisans disrupted German supply lines, communication, and occupation efforts. These irregular forces attacked railways, ambushed patrols, and collected intelligence for the Red Army. Civilians often bore the brunt of reprisals, as entire villages were destroyed in response to resistance activities. Yet these efforts were vital, tying down German forces and eroding morale. Winter and logistics. The harsh Russian winters repeatedly stalled German advances. Tanks froze, vehicles became immobile, and soldiers suffered frostbite and starvation. The Soviet ability to operate in these extreme conditions gave them a decisive advantage. The German High Command's ideological contempt for Russian resilience blinded it to logistical realities, contributing to catastrophic failures. The human cost. The Eastern Front accounted for the majority of military and civilian casualties during the war. Estimates suggest over 25 million Soviets were killed, including soldiers and civilians. Germany suffered over 4 million military deaths. Entire towns were obliterated. Ethnic cleansing, mass executions, and the targeting of political and racial groups became systematic. The front was not only a battlefield but a site of moral catastrophe. Strategic implications. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front forced both sides into total mobilization. Germany diverted massive forces to the east, weakening its ability to defend occupied Western Europe. The Soviet Union, though initially overwhelmed, leveraged manpower, industry, and geography to create a war machine capable of revering the tide. By 1943–1944, the Red Army's counteroffensives began pushing Germany steadily westward, reclaiming lost territory and setting the stage for eventual invasion of the heart of Europe. The Eastern Front demonstrated that warfare could be industrialized, ideologically driven, and merciless. It redefined the limits of human endurance, reshaped national boundaries, and set the stage for the ultimate collapse of the Third Reich. Chapter 7. Africa and the Mediterranean. The struggle for Africa and the Mediterranean was a critical yet often underappreciated theater of the Second World War. Control of North Africa meant access to vital oil supplies, strategic shipping routes through the Mediterranean, and the ability to project military power into southern Europe and the Middle East. For both Axis and Allied powers, this region became a proving ground for strategy, logistics, and endurance. The North African Campaign begins. Italy, under Mussolini, initiated the North African Campaign in 1940, seeking to expand its influence and emulate Germany's successes in Europe. Italian forces invaded Egypt from Libya, hoping to seize the Suez Canal and threaten British colonial interests. The operation, however, was poorly planned and inadequately supplied. British forces quickly counterattacked, pushing Italian troops back and capturing large numbers of prisoners. Germany could not afford to allow Italy to fail. In early 1941, Adolf Hitler dispatched Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to stabilize the front. Rommel, a brilliant tactician known as the Desert Fox, quickly achieved notable victories, advancing deep into Egypt and threatening the British position in the Middle East. Desert warfare. Fighting in the deserts of North Africa presented unique challenges. Sand clogged machinery, heat sapped strength, and water scarcity affected both men and animals. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, making logistics as important as tactical skill. Tanks and armored vehicles dominated open terrain, while air power provided reconnaissance and close support. The campaign became a constant seesaw of advances and retreats. British forces, including units from Australia, India, and South Africa, adapted to desert conditions, ultimately regaining lost ground and launching counteroffensives that would turn the tide. The Mediterranean strategy. The Mediterranean theater was more than North Africa. Control of Sicily, Malta, and southern Italy was essential for securing shipping lanes and projecting power into Europe. The British held Malta against prolonged Axis bombardment, a key strategic victory that disrupted German and Italian supply lines. In 1943, the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily, followed by mainland Italy. These operations forced Germany to divert troops from France and Eastern Europe, weakening the Axis position on multiple fronts. Italian cities and towns were transformed into battlegrounds, and civilians endured occupation, bombardment, and displacement. The Battle of El Alamein. The turning point in North Africa came at El Alamein in late 1942. British General Bernard Montgomery organized a massive counteroffensive that halted Rommel's advance. With superior logistics, intelligence, and artillery, the Allies inflicted decisive losses on Axis forces, marking the beginning of the end for German and Italian ambitions in Africa. The victory had both strategic and symbolic significance. It secured the Suez Canal, safeguarded Middle Eastern oil, and demonstrated that Axis forces could be defeated with proper coordination and planning. Operation Torch. In November 1942, Allied forces launched Operation Torch, landing in Morocco and Algeria. This coordinated invasion forced German and Italian troops to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Axis, unable to sustain operations under this pressure, eventually withdrew from North Africa entirely by May 1943. The defeat marked the collapse of Axis influence on the continent and opened the way for an Allied advance into Italy, directly challenging European Axis defenses. The human dimension. Civilians in North Africa and the Mediterranean endured occupation, forced labor, and aerial bombardment. Entire populations were caught in crossfire as armies maneuvered across deserts, cities, and ports. Yet civilian resistance, espionage, and support for military operations were critical to Allied success. Local knowledge and collaboration often determined the outcome of tactical engagements. Strategic impact. The campaigns in Africa and the Mediterranean demonstrated the importance of logistics, supply lines, and mobility. They tied down German resources, weakened Axis positions, and provided a launching point for invasions of continental Europe. Control of the Mediterranean also ensured that the Allies could sustain operations across multiple theaters, linking North Africa to Italy and beyond. The war in this region was a crucible of strategy, endurance, and international cooperation. It revealed both the ingenuity and resilience of the Allied forces and the vulnerability of Axis powers when extended beyond their logistical capabilities. Chapter 8. Asia and the Pacific. While Europe was consumed by conflict, the war in Asia and the Pacific unfolded with equal ferocity, though on a vastly different scale and geography. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia, the global nature of the conflict became undeniable. In Asia, Japan pursued an imperial vision, seeking to dominate the Pacific and secure access to raw materials, while Allied forces, including the United States, Britain, China, and Commonwealth nations, fought desperately to halt Japanese expansion. Japan's expansion. Japan's militarist government had been pursuing expansionist policies since the early 1930s. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the full-scale war in China from 1937 demonstrated Japan's determination to establish a regional empire. Cities were bombed, populations displaced, and atrocities committed on a massive scale. Civilian suffering in China was staggering, exemplified by the Nanjing Massacre, in which tens of thousands of civilians were executed and women subjected to systematic sexual violence. By 1941, Japan's ambitions extended across Southeast Asia. The goal was to secure oil, rubber, and other resources essential for sustaining its war effort. British, Dutch, and American colonial holdings became prime targets. Pearl Harbor and U.S. entry. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships were destroyed, aircraft wiped out, and thousands of sailors killed. Japan aimed to preemptively neutralize American naval power, giving it free rein to conquer the Pacific. The attack failed strategically. It galvanized the United States, transforming public opinion and ensuring full mobilization for war. Within days, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States in return, further expanding the global conflict. Early Japanese victories. Following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces advanced with astonishing speed. Hong Kong fell, Singapore surrendered, and the Philippines were occupied. The Netherlands' East Indies, rich in oil, rubber, and other strategic materials, were overrun. Japan appeared unstoppable. However, these victories masked underlying weaknesses. Japan's industrial base could not match that of the United States, and its forces were overstretched across vast distances. Logistical constraints and extended supply lines would later contribute to setbacks. Island hopping and Allied counteroffensives. The United States adopted a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions to seize strategically valuable islands. Each captured island served as an airfield, naval base, or staging area for the next advance. Battles were brutal and costly. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima demonstrated the intensity of combat and the human cost of reaching the Japanese mainland. Amphibious assaults required coordination of infantry, artillery, and naval forces under hostile conditions. Japanese defenders often fought to the death, adhering to an ethos that emphasized sacrifice over surrender. Casualties on both sides were extraordinarily high. Naval warfare. Naval supremacy proved decisive in the Pacific. Carrier-based aircraft became the primary instrument of projection, replacing traditional battleships as the centerpiece of naval strategy. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a turning point. The United States destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, irreparably weakening Japan's offensive capacity. Submarine warfare also played a critical role. Allied submarines targeted Japanese merchant shipping, strangling supply lines and weakening Japan's ability to sustain distant garrisons. Control of the seas was essential for both logistics and strategic maneuver. Civilians under occupation. Across Asia, civilians endured forced labor, starvation, and systematic violence. Cities were occupied, agricultural production disrupted, and entire populations coerced into supporting the Japanese war machine. Resistance movements, including guerrilla forces in the Philippines, China, and Southeast Asia, became vital to disrupting Japanese control and gathering intelligence for Allied forces. Strategic turning points. By 1943, Japanese expansion had slowed. Battles in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Coral Sea demonstrated that the Allies could challenge Japanese dominance. Combined with the American industrial output and technological innovations, the Allies were beginning to reverse the momentum. The Pacific War became a war of attrition and logistics. Distance, weather, and terrain shaped strategy as much as combat strength. For Japan, the failure to consolidate early gains and the underestimation of Allied resilience would prove catastrophic. The Asian and Pacific theaters highlighted the global nature of World War II. Victory would require coordination across oceans, continents, and cultures. Civilian populations, naval and air power, and industrial capacity all became decisive factors. The struggle was far from over, but the balance of power was gradually shifting toward the Allies. Chapter 9. Leadership and Power. World War II was shaped not only by armies, weapons, and geography, but also by the decisions, personalities, and ideologies of the leaders who directed it. From strategic planning to moral judgment, leadership determined the tempo, direction, and human cost of the war. The interplay of power, ambition, and personal flaws had consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. Adolf Hitler, ideology and obsession. Adolf Hitler was the central figure of the Axis powers, embodying both Germany's ambitions and its ultimate failures. His ideology fused nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism, dictated military and political strategy. Hitler's personal involvement in operational decisions often overrode professional military judgment. For example, during the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler's insistence on capturing symbolic cities like Stalingrad led to catastrophic losses, diverting forces from strategically vital objectives. Similarly, his refusal to allow tactical withdrawals during the Battle of Kursk and later in Normandy contributed to the collapse of the German army. Hitler's charisma enabled him to maintain control over a fragmented leadership, but his decisions were increasingly guided by ideology and paranoia rather than rational military calculation. The consequences of his personal obsession with conquest and racial purity were catastrophic, shaping not only the military course of the war but also the scale of human suffering. Winston Churchill, defiance and vision. In contrast, Winston Churchill exemplified the role of leadership in inspiring a nation under threat. When Britain stood alone against Germany in 1940, Churchill's speeches and determination rallied the public and military alike. His insistence on resisting at all costs, combined with careful coalition building with the United States and the Soviet Union, ensured that Britain remained a center of resistance. Churchill's leadership also involved practical strategic insight. He advocated for Mediterranean operations, supported technological development, and coordinated with Allied planners. His ability to combine vision with pragmatism allowed Britain to survive, recover, and contribute decisively to Allied victories. Franklin D. Roosevelt, coordination and mobilization. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's leadership was pivotal in transforming American industrial and military capacity into a decisive force. He oversaw the largest mobilization in U.S. history, coordinated complex logistics, and cultivated alliances with both Britain and the Soviet Union. Roosevelt also faced the challenge of balancing domestic politics with global strategy. His ability to sustain American public support, secure wartime funding, and maintain international cooperation was instrumental in sustaining the Allied war effort. Roosevelt's leadership emphasized long-term planning and strategic coordination, ensuring that the United States could project power across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Joseph Stalin, ruthless strategy. Joseph Stalin's leadership combined brutal authoritarian control with strategic calculation. Early Soviet failures exposed weaknesses in command and organization, yet Stalin adapted. By consolidating industrial production, centralizing authority, and enforcing strict discipline, he transformed the Soviet Union into a war machine capable of absorbing immense losses and pushing back the Wehrmacht. Stalin's decisions were often ruthless. He purged officers deemed politically unreliable, imposed severe penalties on retreating troops, and tolerated enormous civilian casualties. Yet his combination of ideological resolve and practical command enabled the Soviet Union to play a decisive role in defeating Germany on the Eastern Front. Leaders of other nations. Other leaders influenced theaters with significant impact. General Charles de Gaulle organized the Free French forces and preserved the continuity of French resistance. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's decisions, often ill-advised, contributed to Italy's military failures. Japanese leaders, including Emperor Hirohito and military commanders, oversaw expansive campaigns but underestimated Allied capacity for mobilization and retaliation. Leadership also extended beyond political figures. Military commanders, planners, and intelligence officers on all sides shaped operational outcomes. Decisions about troop movements, supply chains, and technology often determined victory or defeat. The role of personality in warfare. World War II demonstrated how personal traits, charisma, paranoia, vision, stubbornness, could influence global events. Leaders' beliefs and biases affected strategic choices, alliances, and the timing of offensives. Personal rivalries, ideological obsession, and miscalculations often amplified human suffering and prolonged conflict. At the same time, effective leadership, whether through inspiration, coordination, or strategic foresight, could sustain national morale, maximize resources, and shift the balance of power. The war's outcome depended as much on human judgment as on industrial capacity, military technology, or geographic advantage. Chapter 10. War Crimes and Justice. World War II was not only a military and political struggle, but also a period of unprecedented moral collapse. The scale and systematic nature of war crimes committed by the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, introduced legal, ethical, and historical challenges that continue to shape our understanding of human behavior in conflict. The Holocaust and systematic extermination. The Holocaust remains the most infamous example of industrialized genocide. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany executed a deliberate plan to annihilate the Jewish population of Europe. Millions were deported to extermination camps, including Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where they were murdered using gas chambers, shootings, forced labor, and starvation. Other groups were also targeted. Roma populations, political dissidents, disabled individuals, and prisoners of war were systematically persecuted and executed. The Holocaust demonstrated the lethal potential of bureaucratic efficiency when combined with extremist ideology. War crimes in Asia. Imperial Japan committed widespread atrocities during its conquests. Civilians and prisoners of war in China, Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia were subjected to massacres, forced labor, and sexual violence. The rape of Nanjing in 1937 exemplified the brutality, with estimates of up to 300,000 civilians killed and tens of thousands of women raped. Japanese forced labor programs, known as the Comfort Women System, coerced tens of thousands of women into sexual slavery. Additionally, prisoners of war were subjected to inhumane conditions, often resulting in mass deaths due to disease, starvation, or execution. The legal response. After the war, the Allies recognized the need to establish accountability. The Nuremberg trials, 1945–1946, prosecuted high-ranking Nazi officials for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trials set important precedents, establishing that individuals, regardless of rank or nationality, could be held legally responsible for atrocities committed under orders. Similarly, the Tokyo trials, 1946–1948, addressed Japanese leaders responsible for war crimes in Asia. Defendants were tried for crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These tribunals were the first systematic attempts to apply international law to acts of mass violence on such a scale. Controversies and challenges. While the trials established important legal principles, they were not without controversy. Critics argued about selective prosecution, victor's justice, and cultural biases in legal interpretation. Nevertheless, the establishment of formal procedures for prosecuting war crimes represented a crucial step in international law. Memory and remembrance. The legacy of World War II's war crimes extended beyond courts and legal principles. Survivors, testimonies, documentation of atrocities, and historical research became essential in preserving memory. Memorials, museums, and educational programs aimed to ensure that the magnitude and mechanisms of these crimes were never forgotten. The broader impact. War crimes during World War II reshaped global norms. They demonstrated the necessity of international legal frameworks, led to the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and eventually inspired the creation of institutions such as the International Criminal Court. The war illustrated that mass violence, when unchecked, could escalate to levels of industrialized atrocity, fundamentally challenging assumptions about humanity, morality, and governance. Chapter 11. Aftermath in the Cold War. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 marked both an end and a beginning. While the conflict had formally ceased with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May and Japan in September, its consequences reverberated across the globe. Nations faced unprecedented challenges, rebuilding devastated cities, addressing the needs of millions of displaced persons, prosecuting war criminals, and managing the geopolitical vacuum left by the collapse of empires. At the same time, ideological tensions between former allies laid the groundwork for the Cold War. Devastation and reconstruction. Europe lay in ruins. Cities such as Warsaw, Dresden, and Berlin had been reduced to rubble. Millions were homeless, infrastructure was destroyed, and economies were shattered. Industrial capacity had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, while agricultural regions struggled to feed populations traumatized by famine and displacement. In Asia, the situation was equally dire. Japan had suffered nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and cities obliterated. China, Korea, and Southeast Asian nations faced social upheaval, widespread destruction, and ongoing political instability. The immediate post-war years required massive international assistance. Programs such as the Marshall Plan facilitated European reconstruction, providing billions in aid to rebuild industry, infrastructure, and social systems. In Japan, U.S.-led occupation reforms transformed political, economic, and social structures, laying the foundation for post-war recovery. Displacement and refugees. The war had created unprecedented population movements. Millions of civilians fled advancing armies, survived forced labor, or endured deportations. After the war, millions remained displaced. Refugees, prisoners of war, and Holocaust survivors sought homes, food, and security. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, and later United Nations agencies played critical roles in providing relief, resettlement, and rehabilitation. Despite these efforts, the scale of human suffering was enormous, and recovery took years. War crimes trials and justice. The post-war period was marked by efforts to hold perpetrators accountable. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted top Nazi leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Tokyo trials similarly addressed Japanese leaders, responsibility for atrocities in Asia. These trials established enduring principles that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable for mass atrocities, and that obedience to orders did not absolve moral responsibility. While not all perpetrators were brought to justice, these tribunals set precedents for international law and human rights frameworks that continue to influence global governance. The emergence of superpowers. World War II fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, possessing vast military capabilities, nuclear arsenals, and ideological influence. Western Europe, though central to the war, had been devastated and required external support. The British Empire, weakened by wartime costs and independence movements, began its post-war decolonization. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated over political, economic, and military spheres of influence. Ideological differences, capitalism versus communism, combined with conflicting visions for Europe's reconstruction, laying the foundation for the Cold War. Decolonization and global change. The war accelerated the decline of colonial empires. Independence movements in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East gained momentum, inspired both by weakened European powers and wartime promises of self-determination. In 1947, India achieved independence from Britain, a watershed moment in post-war decolonization. Simultaneously, the United Nations was established in 1945 to provide a platform for international cooperation, conflict resolution, and the prevention of future global wars. Its creation reflected lessons learned from the failures of the League of Nations and the need for multilateral governance. Memory, trauma, and cultural impact. World War II left profound psychological, cultural, and historical legacies. Literature, art, and film grappled with themes of loss, heroism, atrocity, and moral ambiguity. Survivors recounted experiences of concentration camps, bombings, and displacement, ensuring that collective memory preserved the lessons of the conflict. Societies confronted moral and ethical questions about complicity, resistance, and justice. The Holocaust, in particular, forced a reckoning with human capacity for cruelty, prompting the development of Holocaust education, memorialization, and scholarship. The Cold War begins. The immediate post-war era saw Europe divided between Western democratic-aligned states and Eastern states dominated by the Soviet Union. Germany, Berlin, and other regions were partitioned, reflecting the new ideological divide. Nuclear weapons, developed in secret during the war, added a new dimension of threat and deterrence, ushering in the nuclear age. The Cold War would dominate international relations for nearly half a century, a direct consequence of the unresolved tensions and power vacuums created by World War II. Former allies became rivals, and the global order shifted from multipolar balance to a bipolar struggle. Conclusion. The aftermath of World War II was a complex mix of devastation, recovery, justice, and geopolitical transformation. Nations rebuilt, societies healed, and international institutions emerged to prevent future conflicts. Yet the shadow of the war, the trauma, the moral questions, and the ideological divides remained, shaping the modern world. From the ruins of global conflict arose a new order, one defined by superpower rivalry, human rights law, decolonization, and the enduring memory of humanity's capacity for both destruction and resilience. World War II had ended, but its consequences would resonate across generations.